Okay, it is time to begin today, so glad to have you out on a lovely winter day, spring day, whatever. We'll take the sun while we can get it and thank the Lord for the precipitation in the meantime. Okay, let's open with a word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you so much once again for your abounding goodnesses to us on a daily basis. We know that here in America, we are a privileged people. We're glutted with so many things, and so help us in the midst of all this glut and all this stuff to never forget that it's only because of your goodness to us, it's your kindness, it's your open hand, and help us to be sure that we consistently thank you for every good and wonderful gift that we possess. We do thank you we live in a country where we can still freely gather like this and worship you. We thank you for the people of God in this place that we can call our home here at Kaysville Bible Church, and we ask for your continued, explicit, wonderful, matchless work in our lives as we try and honor you in all that we do. We pray for your explicit help this hour as we try to understand some more of what you've said in the New Testament, as well as look at the basis in the Old, and we trust your provision now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we are in this series entitled, as you see at the top, Heroes of the Faith, Faithful People in the Bible and Church History. And we're using Hebrews chapter 11 as our basis. And then, of course, we're having to look back at the Old Testament to see what was so profound that in the Old Testament that God would say that these people are heroes. And at the top of your sheet, and if you failed to bring back with you this week your one that says number 3 up in the right-hand corner. You need to be sure that you have one of those, and Sean will be sure and get you one if you don't have that one with you from last week. But there is a correction to make there, and I see Wilson is not here, and I was going to get on his case for... There's Wilson, okay. Wilson, I am very shocked that you failed to correct me when I gave a wrong date on the timeline. Of course, I figure it's because of you're so gracious, you didn't want to publicly shame me. But on the very right of this timeline, we're on week number 3 now. The handout you got when you came in that says number 4 at the top, Lord willing, we'll get to that. But we're on number 3 today to start. Up at the top where it says Isaac death, 1896. This week Isaac rolled over in his grave and said, Royce, what are you talking about? It was actually 1886. So if you will please make that correction. Isaac death is 1886, okay? If you heard a rumbling this week and thought it was a earthquake here in Utah, it wasn't. It was Isaac rolling in his grave because I had put a wrong date from his tombstone. Okay, now that we have that cleared up, let's get on with the good stuff. Okay, so today we begin in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. And beginning with verse 8, in verses 8 to 12 and 17 to 19, our writer of Hebrews is now going to focus on Abraham and Sarah. And that is very logical, number one, because Abraham, of course, is going to be in the family line through whom God is going to bless the world with His revelation, as well as with all His covenant promises and the Messiah. And number two, Abraham is called the father of those who have faith. And that's going to be an expression that you'll find as we get then to the New Testament and so forth. So over on the left-hand side there you see 2166 is a very standard date for the birth of Abraham. And these other dates are all going to be sort of coming into play as we look at his life and play out some of these particular incidences. So Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8 says, By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. Okay? So Abraham, by faith, obeyed. And that's what we find in the case of all of these individuals. They express their faith by their obedience. It's not enough to simply say, well, yeah, I have faith, okay, let's get on with life. It's, well, if you really have faith, you're going to obey. You're going to act upon it. And so this is really interesting because we might say when God knocked on his door, Or as I like to think of it, when God put his hand on Abraham's shoulder and said, Abraham, I am calling you to leave where you are and to go to a new place. And as it says here, he simply said, yes, Lord, thy servant heareth. That sort of was that Samuel, the boy Samuel, who said that hundreds of years later. And he said, okay, God, I will go by faith. Now here it doesn't particularly tell us where he was or anything like that. But in Genesis 11:27-32, it says he was a native of Ur of the Chaldees. And I didn't really have space to put on a map on here, but you can, probably in the back of your Bible, you can look at a map and you can realize Ur of the Chaldees is a long way from Canaan or Palestine. It is way over to the east, and it is almost down on the Persian Gulf, which seems to be in the news a good bit in the last 20 years or so. And so God was knocking on his door, putting his hand on his shoulder, way over there in Ur of the Chaldees. And we know, interestingly enough, that Ur of the Chaldees was noted for its moon worship. So from all indication, Abraham was raised, shall we say, from a boy as a good moon worshiper. He was not a servant of the Lord. And so there are a lot of questions you have when you read the Bible concerning Abraham. For example, how did he ever hear of Yahweh? How did he ever hear of the Lord if that whole area, because remember, we're going way back, 2166, 2130, 40, thereabouts. This is a long way back. How did he ever hear of Yahweh so that when God called him, he would even respond to it? We might say, how did God reveal himself? Was it in a dream? Was it the angel of the Lord appeared to him and he, this mysterious visitor? We don't know. We don't know. But that's shall we say, emphasizes even more this key, by faith he obeyed. And God didn't say, now you're in Ur of the Chaldees and I'm calling you and you're going to end up in Jerusalem, which is, over there close to the Mediterranean Sea if you flunked your geography class in junior high. No. God says, I want you to leave here. I'm calling you to a place that he wasn't even familiar with at the time, per se. Had no idea where it was. He just said, God knocked, and I'm willing to take it a step at a time, knowing somehow God will put me in the right place at the right time. Now, if you don't think that is radical, put yourself in those shoes and think of yourself even today when maybe God asks us to do certain things, and it's like, no way, God, you've got to be a lot more explicit on details. I can't walk away from all this comfy stuff and just say, God is calling me, I'm going to be faithful, and I know I can trust God, he's going to work it out. But that's exactly what Abraham was doing. And thus, as the quote says on your sheet, he accepted an inheritance on trust without even knowing where it was to be. It was because he left behind the seen world of his former days and launched into a project involving an unseen inheritance that he has become an example of daring faith, and he merits the title, the father of the faithful. And remember what we saw in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 11. What is faith? It is being able to see the unseen. It is having confidence that what God says I can really lean on, even though I can't fully explain it at this particular time. And so on your timeline, you see there, you don't see it, but you could maybe add 2091, because Abraham is 75 years old, so it was about 2091 when this call of God came to him. Now, in chapter 11 and verse 9 of Hebrews, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. And so this is reminding us, because you say, well, how is that by faith? Well, notice it says, he is sojourning in the land as a stranger. So now when he did get to Canaan, when he made it there, he still did not say, okay, God, you just revealed to me this is my place, and I walked away from hundreds and hundreds of miles away from here and property, so this is my property. No, he got there, And God said, I'm going to eventually give this to your family, but right now you are still a stranger. And remember what the end of verse 13 says here in Hebrews 11? All of these great people of the faith confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. In other words, they were acknowledging that this world was not their home, they were just passing through. They weren't supposed to drive their tent spikes too deeply or anything of the sort, because God was saying you need to still have that pilgrim attitude, that attitude of that this world really isn't your home. There is a greater world, and you are simply passing through here. And so with these words that are used here, it's emphasizing that fact to us. And then notice what it says. He lived in tents just like Isaac and Jacob. All of this imagery is reminding us that he didn't see himself as, shall we say, an urbanite or a suburbanite. He saw himself rather as a nomadic individual. And he said, somehow God is giving all this real estate to my ancestors for an eternal possession. But right now, I can't even go to the county courthouse and say, pull up that deed so I can see that it says Abraham is the owner of these 100 acres or whatever. Nope. But he was willing to live that way. He was living by faith. He was trusting God that down the road God would do all that, but in the meantime, he was simply asked to walk with God. Now, chapter 11, and we'll omit verse 10 here because we talked about that verse before in a previous lesson, because that is explaining all of these people in this chapter who walk by faith. But 11:11, through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Now, including Sarah here might seem a little bit strange to us, because you remember that Sarah was barren all these years of her marriage. In fact, when she was 76 years old, and Abraham basically said, well, I've got to help God out of the corner he backed himself into by having an offspring that I'm the dad, but it's okay. Culture said it was okay for me to have sex with one of my wife's slaves. And so he said, okay, we'll do it. Sarah was 76 years old when that happened. And then when she was 89 years old and God said, you are actually going to be the mother. That child doesn't count in the genealogy. But Abraham has to be the dad, and Sarah, you have to be the mom. She is 89 years old when that first message came, and it's no wonder the text says Abraham laughed and she laughed. And Abraham pleaded with God, come on, God, I already got you out of a desperate situation. Just count Ishmael as the heir. And God said, no way. No way. That's not the way it should be. So here she is. She's 90 years old. She gets pregnant. And as the last line of Hebrews 11:11 says, she judged him faithful who had promised. In other words, this was a real act of faith. Because she said, Abraham is now 100 years old. I'm 90 years old. I'm not supposed to be getting pregnant and having children, but God said, this is the way it is, and I will trust him because God really has this figured out. Wow. Now that is impressive faith. It's no wonder she was included here. Okay? Now, very quickly, and I don't want to get off on this very much at all, but is there anybody here who's using an NIV and you're reading this and you're saying, wait a minute, that's not what my translation says? Nobody here using an NIV? Okay. Well, maybe I should say why I said that, or else you're going to go home and check it out and then say, why did he say it? Okay, it's because actually this is a very difficult text grammatically in Greek. And the NIV says, by faith Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, Abraham was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had promised. Seems to change the whole thing, and the thrust is all on Abraham, and it's not on Sarah at all. She's just kind of an aside in the story. And you say, how can that be? Well, and there are a couple of other translations that do the same. It's because The Greek text actually says, Sarah received power into the casting forth or the depositing of semen. And you say, wait a minute, that's a male activity. It's not the woman who casts forth or places semen into the other person. Okay. So what in the world is going on here? And that's why interpreters simply say, whoa, this is a difficult text. Now, what in the world does that mean, or how in the world am I going to explain it? Well, what's always the easiest thing to do when you come to a difficult text? Pardon? Look at the other text, but the other texts don't really solve it. Skip over it or just delete the Greek words. That's right. So we'll just delete the Greek words. Well, wait a minute. That's always a cop-out. That's not the best hermeneutical way to try and go back to the Hebrew. The Hebrew doesn't really help anything here. Sometimes they will change the case of the Greek words. And for those of you who haven't had Greek, don't worry about it. But it's going from a nominative case to a dative case so that then you can read it the way the NIV does. Others simply will say, well, maybe this Greek word actually has a little different nuance, etc. So there are a lot of different ways like that, okay? I simply bring that out so if you do look at a different text and say, whoa, that seems to be so contrary to the way the AV has it here. Fortunately, I think the King James Version is right in the way they've tried to do it. Same way the ESV, the Legacy Standard Bible today, etc., they all follow this kind of interpretation, the interpretation that puts the emphasis on Sarah. And I think that's actually the way to do it. I think there are ways around explaining it, okay? But the point simply is, this is an amazing story. This is an amazing example of the faith that she had and that he had. Chapter 11 and verse 12, the writer now goes back to Abraham. Therefore sprang there even of one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. So in other words, it's reminding us that from this one man who was as good as dead, and his wife was barren, because remember, for all those years she had been barren. That's why she hadn't gotten pregnant before. It was an act of God that kept her from getting pregnant before. Yet from them came, and notice this wonderful imagery, more than the skies in the heaven for multitude, and more than the sand that's on the seashore. I mean, what great imagery! What great imagery to show us this great abundance of this race. And then when we move to, we've already talked about 13 to 16, verses 13 to 16, because that describes characteristics of all of these heroes of faith. Now when we get to verse 17 to 19, we're introduced to another incident in Abraham's life which shows a great act of faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Now, if you look on your timeline, you see a 2051 with a question mark beside it, and it says sacrifice of Isaac. The question mark is there because we are not exactly sure how old Isaac would have been at this time when his dad took him up the mount to sacrifice him. I've put him here as, a 15-year-old or so, roughly, and that's just kind of a guess going along with what other writers say. You'll find other writers who will say, actually, he was a 30-year-old man at the time, etc. I really don't think he was quite that old, but he wasn't just a 6-year-old boy who basically, ooh, this is really neat, I'm having a camp out just with Dad, nobody else. No, he was plenty old to know what's going on and all that kind of stuff. So if you differ with me by a year or two, it's not a hill we'll die on, okay? But again, it's referencing this story back in Genesis chapter 22, and it's showing us that God had already told Abraham that Isaac was to be the rightful heir through whom all these covenant promises had come. And you can go back and look at all those references that I've listed for you there on the sheet. So in other words, Abraham knew and Isaac knew that Isaac was going to be the one to carry on this progeny. He was the special son. And I mean, just think of how much Abraham had bargained with God through the years to get to this point. I mean, he'd taken Eliezer, and again, it was okay. It was fine culturally to take your servant and make him your heir if you didn't have a legitimate heir. And then when God said, no, that's not the way to do it, and then it was with Ishmael, as Abraham and Hagar got together, and God had to say no, even though culturally that was acceptable. And so finally God answered, well, didn't answer his prayer because Abraham really hadn't prayed that God would do it that way, but finally God just said, here's going to be your heir through Sarah. And now, when it's all said and done, and here's this boy growing up and he's so excited, wow, here's my son, let's just say he's 15 years old, heir to all these promises. And now it's like God pulls the rug out from under him and says, I want you to kill him. Do you think Abraham had any qualms? Do you think there were a lot of things going through his mind? And I'm not trying to slam him. As you'll see as we walk through here, and as I'll illustrate in a minute, I'm just trying to think of all this the way, humanly speaking, as we're trying to please God and walk with God and things come our way, and we might not publicly verse it and say, God, are you sure I heard you correctly? Did you really say that? That just didn't seem to make all that much sense to me. And so I can imagine, on the one hand, Abraham is having some reservations here. He's really wondering what in the world is going on. Well, as it says, this is his only begotten son. And again, with that expression, the Greek expression simply means unique, and you will find a lot of modern translations that use that expression. His unique son, because remember, he wasn't the only son or the only begotten son of Abraham. Abraham had other sons too, okay? But he was the unique son, and therefore, this just doesn't seem to make sense when God says, this is the one through whom all the covenant promises are going to go, and now I'm supposed to go and sacrifice him. Well, the language is actually interesting here because there is a fine nuance in the Greek where the same word is used twice very close to each other with different tenses. And so without getting too technical, it says, by faith, Abraham, being tested, had offered Isaac. And the Greek tense is one which says there was a past action and the results have continued. And so what it basically says is, by faith, Abraham had already sacrificed Isaac and he was dead. And yet when you read the story, you find out he hadn't yet sacrificed him at this time. He was still alive. And you keep reading here in Hebrews 11, and it says, the one receiving the promises was about to offer his son. A different tense telling us he hadn't done it yet. But the point I think the writer is making with this fine grammatical difference is he was saying that because of Abraham's faith, in his mind it was a sacrifice as good as already done. In other words, he said, okay, God, I don't get it. When I start trying to add up, humanly speaking, all these things, it doesn't seem to make perfect sense to me. But I've tried to bargain with you before and say, God, you backed yourself in a corner, let me get you out of it. And you said, no, Abraham, you trust me. I'm not backed in a corner. And I can just see Abraham's mind computing all this, and he's saying, you know what, I blew it before, but I'm not going to strike out and have a third strike against me here and tell God he doesn't know what he's doing. So he says, I'm going to do it. In my mind, it's as good as done, even though he hasn't yet done it. But as we see, as he says right here, it's like in verse 19, the writer goes behind the scenes and tells us the thought process. Abraham realized this was the heir. Abraham knew God said that Isaac would be the one through whom the promises would come. Abraham knew that God was faithful to his word. and therefore he said, I trust God to somehow raise him up if I actually have to kill him. And we get that because notice what verse 19 says, accounting or reasoning that God was able to raise. Now notice in the King James Version here, the word him is actually in italics. And when it's in italics, what does it mean? It means you emphasize it extra, right? Because the writer italicized it? No, it means it's not there. Okay? So it says, accounting that God was able to raise up even from the dead. You say, Royce, you're picking a lot of hairs today. You're really making fine points. What's the deal? Well, the fine point here seems to be that Abraham is actually saying, I believe in resurrection, which is more than just saying, I believe somehow God can raise up my son. He's saying, no, I believe in resurrection, this whole umbrella, and because I believe in resurrection, that means if my son is supposed to be killed, God will raise him up as a specific example of the greater truth of resurrection that I believe. Now that's really amazing because where are we in history? We're way back there, okay? And remember, these Jews are supposed to be dumb. They're not supposed to know much about the afterlife until the Persians teach them 1,700 years later. I say that with tongue in cheek if you're not too close to see me. Because that's what scholarship likes to say. Well, the Jews really didn't believe in any of this stuff yet. It was the Persians who taught them that in the 300s and 400s. No. This, from all indication, predates Job. And why do I say that's amazing? Job believed in resurrection. Remember that great passage in Job chapter 19? I know that my Redeemer liveth, and someday he will stand on the earth, and though flesh and even though worms consume my body, yet I'm glad that I'm just a memory in people's minds. Is that what he said? He said, no. Yet from my flesh I shall see God. And this would predate Job. I mean, Job, I believe, is probably a contemporary of Abraham or back there in the 1900s from all indications. But this is even before that. And he says, I have a resurrection faith. And so it's no big deal if God says you have to kill your son. God is able to pull this off. All I need to do is lean on him and trust his word.
So did the Chaldeans have any kind of idea of any life after death or anything?
The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, yeah, a lot of these other people did, but it was a completely different thing. And as far as saying resurrection as the Bible taught it, it differed. So somehow he'd been instructed by God. He had more revelation than just the average person. Yeah. Yep. But and this is a whole other thing, and some of you have heard me say before, that I think there are so many intimations of the next life in the Old Testament that we just easily read over, that we don't stop and say, wait a minute, that sounds just so simple, and yet in reality, when you start thinking of it and putting two and two together with other stuff, you say, wow, these people really did have. Now granted, they were looking forward and they did not have a lot of the knowledge that we have, but when we look back to Jesus' resurrection, how much knowledge do we really have? I mean, honestly, how much detail can we go into concerning, say, a resurrection body and how everything is going to work out in the next life? We've got an awful lot of questions, and we're supposed to be an enlightened 21st century American, right? But we have to trust God that there is such a thing as resurrection, and God is going to do what He says. And that's no different in one sense than them. They look forward, we look back, but in both cases it takes faith to bank on God and believe, you know what? Don't know. I don't see people being resurrected every day when I pass the Kaysville Cemetery, whatever, but God says it's going to happen, so I believe it's going to happen. Okay. Pardon?
Isaac was born from a dead womb that was brought to life, so he had already been brought to life from the
Right, and that's and some people when they're interpreting some of these phrases try and use that as well and say, well, actually, that's what it's being referred to, the fact that Sarah's womb was dead before, and so it's no wonder that he saw resurrection here. And it's possible like that he somehow saw it. But yeah, I just find this is a really fascinating text indeed. But interestingly, when you go back to Genesis chapter 22, the account, and you read, it talks about Abraham took his son Isaac and started walking toward Mount Moriah. And it says when they got at the base of the mountain, he told his servants, "You stay here." And he said, "I and the lad will go yonder." And it doesn't necessarily come out very strong in the English, but it says literally, "We will worship and we will come to you." First person plural of the verb is used. Why is that so significant? Because again, Abraham was showing his resurrection faith. He said, "You guys stay back here. My son and I are going to go up, and together we're going to have a worship experience, and together we're both going to come back to you." So he didn't say, "We're going to go up and worship, and I'll come back to you because I'll bury my son up there and then hope somehow in the future there is a resurrection." First person plural. We're going to worship together, and we're going to come back, and then we'll go back home, all of us together like we came. Wow. Amazing, amazing resurrection faith. Now, very quickly, the last expression in verse 19 is difficult. "From whence also he received him in a figure." King James translates like as that. The NIV, figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Good speed from the dead, he did indeed, to speak figuratively, receive him, etc. So exactly what does this mean? Well, I put some options on your sheet because there are kind of different ways you can take it. Some would say Abraham thought his son would die, so now he's saying it's just like he got him back from the dead. Others say Abraham received him back in a way that prefigured resurrection. Others interpret it that Isaac was a type of Christ. So what happened to Isaac in a parable or figure actually happened when God raised Jesus. And again, I don't know that any of those are it's not like any of those you would say, well, that's false teaching, that's wrong. So maybe it's a combination of all those coming together as to what that particular expression means. But remember what Hebrews 11:1 told us about faith. It is the assurance, it said, of what you cannot see. And so Abraham somehow was assured that even though his eyes couldn't see something, he was assured that it was true because God told him that's the way it was. Now, what's that next chart that I drew there on your sheet? Well, that's kind of just a little graph, if you will, as we look at Abraham's life, because so many chapters in the book of Genesis are devoted to him, to try and help us see what I would call the ups and downs of living by faith. And I do this because this ought to encourage us, since, no doubt there are times when we get discouraged, when we look in a mirror at our own Christian life, and we say, "Royce, how could you, if you say you've been saved over 50 years, how in the world should you ever make a decision like that? How could you ever do that? How could you not trust God when He says something?" And when we look at Abraham, in 11:27 to 12:5, he was called. That's what I would call a real up factor, okay? In other words, God knocked on his door, as we said. He answered that knock, and wow, you talk about living by faith, the pinnacle of it. But then we get to chapter 12, and what happens? He goes down into Egypt, and he says, "I've got to lie because I can't trust God to take care of us, and they might take my wife." Abraham, I thought you have faith. I thought you believed God could take care of you since you left your home hundreds and hundreds of miles away to come here, and now you get here and you don't believe God can sustain you? What kind of father of the faithful are you with an attitude like that? But then all of a sudden we get to chapter 13 and he's having a conflict, or there's a conflict between Lot his nephew and Abram's herdsman. And this whole place is before him. And remember, Abraham is the top dog here. Okay, Lot's an underling. And so Abraham didn't say, okay, little boy, I'm going to take my piece of real estate and then you can have the scraps and I hope it's worth something. No. He said, well, you go ahead and you choose first and I'll take the leftovers. And the biblical writer is quick to comment that Lot chose on the basis of what his eyes could see, this world's living, and Abraham was trusting God that the real estate that was left would be a good enough piece for him. And sure enough, it says it really was. Wow, what a contrast. Now, that's a walking by faith there. But God blessed him and rewarded him for it. And then with this whole Melchizedek thing, again, that's what I would call an upper. That was walking by faith. But then we get to chapter 15 with Eliezer. And why did he take Eliezer as his heir? Because he didn't have children, and God had said, you're going to have all this progeny. So it was okay, well, I've got to have some heir on the will that says it goes through him. And God had to say, no. Chapter 16 with Ishmael, God had to say, no, that's not the way you're going to get your offspring. And notice right below it the quote I put, how the family customs of the patriarchs in Genesis 15 to 31 are unfamiliar to modern readers, but their significance has been remarkably illumined by parallels from cuneiform tablets found at Ur, and especially Nuzi in Mesopotamia. And you can look on a map for Nuzi. According to the usage in these documents, a childless couple, this fits in with Genesis 15, might adopt as an heir one of their servants. Or else the wife might produce an heir by proxy, so to speak, Genesis 16, by giving her handmaid to her husband. But if a couple did subsequently have a son of their own, then he automatically became chief heir in place of any servant or handmaid's son. And that's what happened when then they had Isaac. It negated the previous two. But we know from ancient documents in Nuzi and Ur, two very famous places where we've gotten a lot of archaeological material, we know that this was the common culture of the day. And so the point I'm trying to make here is, notice how at this point in his life, Abraham has been, shall we say, a Christian for a good number of years, and yet look how he is still thinking like the world looks and trying to live the way the contemporary culture around him lives. And what a challenge that ought to be to us, because how many times do we look, and if we have our life on a timeline and say, look how many years I've been saved, but man alive, this last week, just look at how I was thinking like unsaved people. I was acting just like the culture around me. I was letting the world squeeze me into its mold. And that's exactly what Abraham was doing here. But then, of course, we moved to chapters 17 to 18 and 21 with Isaac. Wow, that is a walking by faith, because when God said, you're going to be the dad, Sarah's going to be the mom, he trusted God and he said, okay, Sarah, we need to spend some time together because this isn't going to be a virgin birth. Okay, I'm going to have to get you pregnant if this is going to happen. But he trusted God to work in that way. But then in chapter 20, he lies again about his wife. And you say, Abraham, don't you get it? Haven't you looked in a mirror to realize that you're supposed to be a man of faith? How can you do that? But then chapter 22, the sacrifice, whoa, that's off the charts in trusting God. But then in chapter 25, we're told about all these children he had by his concubines. And he knew that wasn't acceptable. He knew the way God originated one man for one woman at the beginning. But it was culturally acceptable to have concubines and etc. And so you just see this up and down in this life of faith. And hopefully every up is a little bit higher up than the previous one, and every down isn't quite as low as the previous down. But I do this, as I say, simply as a challenge for us when we think of, what I talk about as carpet theology and cloud theology. Because once again, remember how these New Testament letters, especially Paul, really emphasizes in the beginning of the book, like the first, we'll just say half, the first part of each of his letters, he talks about cloud theology, where he talks about all these great promises of God, all this neat stuff that God has done for us. But then when he gets to the middle of the book, he simply says, okay, you can't just walk around and say, I'm saved, I'm a Christian, I have a ticket to heaven in my back pocket, I can live the way I want. It's no. You've got to live it out on the carpet. You've got to live it out on the carpet. And you think of like Abraham, all this cloud theology he had, these incredible promises from God. But there was still the daily struggle of every day putting it to practice in the midst of a culture that is trying to squeeze Abraham into its mold and make him think just like they do. And so, and of course, as you've heard me say before, I draw it like this because King James Version often uses the word worthy here when it talks about have a lifestyle that is worthy of the gospel that you profess. And the word worthy is actually a Greek word that has to do with equivalence or balance. And so God was telling Abraham, as God is telling us, we need to have a lifestyle that perfectly balances the greatness of the promises God has given to us and of what God has revealed to us. So wow, what a fantastic challenge, what a fantastic example for us. Okay, questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions? So there would be family secrets that you would try and keep from her. I don't know. Maybe that was the ultimate test for him. He was going to tell her and say, "I know it's going to be a big struggle, but that will just prove that I really have more faith than I do." I don't know. Yeah. But as you can see, there's a lot of unwritten stuff we wish would be written. But when you stop and think of our lives, and you think of all the stuff that goes on between the big decisions, etc., I think we get a great picture here of what God wants us to do. Okay, let's move then to the second handout, and this was the one you should have received when you entered. Up at the top, it should say on the right-hand side, number 4, 225-24. And of course, it has another timeline to start, so you know that this is officially authorized material. No, actually, the timeline hopefully can help us because there's a lot going on, and oftentimes it is because of the timeline. When you start placing it, you begin to say, wow, this is what really adds the punchline to the story. So the next 3 verses in Hebrews, chapter 11, verses 20, 21, and 22, are now devoted to the next 3 major characters in Genesis after Abraham. So we have Isaac, and we have Jacob, and we have Joseph. Now, to me, a really fascinating thing is you think that a good half of Genesis is devoted to these 3 guys. Basically, chapters 24 to 50 are devoted to the lives of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So how many verses do we have to summarize their life? 3 verses. And it's like, come on. How can you summarize the life so succinctly, if you will, with 1 verse for each one when the Old Testament spent 10 or more chapters trying to give us a little bit of understanding? And even when you read those chapters, there's some difficult things. It's like, wow, I wish I had more pieces of the puzzle to put together. And so I'll be very honest with you here. As we talk about these, I'm going to say a lot of things that I can't point at a verse and say, well, look, it specifically says it there. I mean, in my Bible, it actually, when I read it between the lines, or if I read the Hebrew and turn it upside down and look at it in a mirror, it says it very clearly. But it's just not plain when you read the English, okay? And so it's like, whoa, so what is when the writer of Hebrews says, look what he did by faith, you read the Old Testament and say, That was an act of faith. That's kind of weird to say that was the great act of faith in his life. I think I'd have highlighted something else. But I mean, who am I to correct a biblical writer, right? So I'm not trying to do that. I'm just saying a person can struggle with some of these and say, well, what's the point? And that's why, as we look at each of these, and it's very evident we're not going to be able to finish this sheet today, so guess what you need to do, Tom? Just skip over. No, you fold it and put it in your pocket and wear the same shirt next week. Oh, man, Tom, yeah. Okay, no. See, Wilson, I don't just get on you. I get on Tom too. Yeah, okay. So I've tried to lay out some things from the Old Testament as I personally, shall you say, wrestle with this as well. How in the world does this one event mentioned in Hebrews 11 show a great act of faith when you look at the tenor of this person's life in the Old Testament? And I think as you do, there are some keys there, and you begin to see it. But I'll kind of, is it okay if I give you a spoiler alert? And if you don't want a spoiler alert, hold your hand over your ears. But I think basically in the lives of especially Isaac and Jacob, we're going to see this up and down, the ups and downs of living by faith, just like we saw with Abraham, that we could put their life kind of on the same kind of grid, if you will. And we see where they have some high moments and you say, yes, that's what God wanted to see with you. And then all of a sudden it's like the bottom falls out and it's like, what? A man of faith walks like that? That's your daily lifestyle? And then all of a sudden it's, there's a high point again. But before you get too high, it's like, whoa, the bottom's falling out again. And so when you do look at these events that are mentioned here in Hebrews 11, it's like, you know what? That really is a big step of faith. It might not sound like all that much, but boy, that really is believing, seeing, shall we say, seeing the invisible. It's having confidence that God said it. And because God said it, I can be assured that He will be faithful to His promises. So I put a quote at the top that maybe can help us as well. Because to be honest with you, when you start reading in this area, most writers aren't going to give you much help and say, well, it's real easy to understand why the writer of Hebrews 11 says what he does. But I think this is a good point to note. What impresses the author about these patriarchs was that they had a faith that looked beyond death. And here we go with this whole bit of eschatology again, and these people really did believe there was such a thing as life after death. With all three, the significant thing was their firm conviction that death cannot frustrate God's purposes. Their faith was such that they were sure God would work His will so they could speak with confidence of what would happen even after they died, what God would work out in the fulfilling of His will. So let's jump in with Isaac and see if maybe we can cover most of Isaac today. It simply says here, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning coming things. Now, maybe we could set the stage by walking through some of these key points of Isaac's life that I put on your sheet, basically 9 of them, because to be honest with you, when you read the Old Testament on Isaac's life, his life seems what I would call pretty bland, and it doesn't really seem like he did all that many things by faith. Okay? So what in the world is going on here? Well, number one, just quickly, and I'll just fill in a couple of things. Number one, Isaac was the son of promise, the heir to the Abrahamic covenant blessings. So I assume that he had heard this often as he was growing up, because that was a really big deal. I mean, when you stop and think of it, that he's going to assume the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. And remember how he was born when his parents were older. I have a sneaky feeling his mom and dad talked to him a lot about that. You know what, Isaac? You weren't originally written on the will. Eliezer was and Ishmael was. But we trusted God and we had to change our will because you're the son of promise. So I have a feeling as he was growing up, he heard that story often and he heard it over and over. I mean, how many times did your parents tell you stuff maybe about your childhood that you wouldn't have known, the little nitty-gritty things, the ins and outs of some things, that as you grew up you said, wow, I'm really glad my parents talked about that because that was a big deal. Number two, We then see, and this is by looking at the timeline, Isaac was a 37-year-old bachelor when his mother died. Remember, he's growing up. And again, we could go into a lot of detail on this, but we know he was a 37-year-old bachelor because we read when his mother died and he was not yet married. He wouldn't be married for another 3 years, and he got married at 40. So here he is, he's a 37-year-old bachelor. He's heard his parents tell him over and over, you are the covenant choice by God, and you're going to have more offspring than the sand on the seashore and the stars in heaven. And here he is as a 35-year-old sitting on the back porch on a rocking chair, and he's saying, I ain't even got a wife. And you're telling me I'm carrying on all these great promises? And then his mom dies. And maybe he's thinking, man, am I going to be a disappointment to Mom, or is it good Mom died so that story she told me so often, she doesn't realize it's really not going to be fulfilled with me? Now again, I guarantee I'm reading some things in here, but I look at this humanly, and so I ask, do you think he was sweating at that time? Thinking, look at how old I am, and God's going to do all this great stuff, but I'm not even married yet. How's this going to come about? Also, we know that the death of his mother greatly grieved him. It tells us that. Because it tells us when he finally got married 3 years later, and he went into the tent to Rebekah, all of a sudden he was comforted. His grief was now gone. And you can't help but again, kind of reading between the lines, but think and say, you know what? Did he now say, okay, God, I've stopped sweating because now I have a wife, and so I believe I really can be the one to fulfill your covenant promises? And yet at the same time, notice my number 4, Rebekah was barren for 20 years. You see these fascinating ways God works in a life? So here he is, he's sweating one moment, rejoicing the next moment, and for 20 years his wife can't get pregnant for one simple reason. Because God says she's not getting pregnant. She's a barren woman. And do you think he's really starting to sweat now and say, oh God, you really have backed yourself in a corner. What does contemporary culture say I can do? What is acceptable for me to get the air so that you don't look bad before people? Well, do you think during those days, as he was having doubts, that he was just saying, how can there be such numerous progeny? Number 5, when Rebekah was pregnant with twins and given a prophecy about them, do you think Isaac had a lot of questions in his mind? Because now, all of a sudden, what do you think he might be saying? You with me? Tom, what might he be saying? And he's not saying you can cancel the text. What happened? But what else? God says it is through you that all these blessings are going to come, and now you're going to have 2 sons, twins. So what do you think he might be thinking? Which one? Now I've got a problem, God. How am I going to decide which son gets the blessing? Although God told him right at that moment, the elder is going to serve the younger. So do you think that really stuck in his head, even though he might have not talked about it very much? Don't know. When Abraham died, 1991, BC, at 175 years old, and this is maybe a crazy question, but do you think the estate was settled with Ishmael and with all of Abraham's concubines in an amicable manner? Well, now the text does say that Abraham had already sent the children of his concubines off to foreign lands and said, will you go there and I'll help you purchase a house over in that city. And I think it was because he realized there could be a lot of problems. But you really wonder, I mean, think of today when parents die and now all of a sudden it's the children who have to divide the estate, how much hassle there can be when previously you thought they were one big happy family. So you kind of wonder if now is he saying, oh man, now I'm going to have to just fight for it because they're going to say, no, Abraham's line goes through me. It doesn't go through you. Number 7, would you call this patriarchal family dysfunctional? chapter 25, then in chapter 27, when you see that he loved one of the twins, his wife loved the other one, and they did everything they could to favor them. You have to think, yeah, there was a lot of strife in that family. Number 8, at the time of the famine, the Lord assured him all these covenant promises were intact, so he could go to Egypt, it would be okay, and yet he lied about Rebekah. Do you think he did that because he didn't trust God's promises maybe? And he thought, you know what? I could be murdered down there and this whole shebang falls apart. And then what's God going to do? Oh, they're going to speak bad things about God. I've got to rescue God. God said, no, you don't. You don't need to lie about me. And God providentially intervened. Finally, as we think of this act of blessing, we need to remember that Isaac knew prior to their birth the oldest twin would serve the younger. But I can't help but wonder if all throughout his life he actually was fighting against God. Because remember, when he blessed Esau, he thought he was blessing. He thought he was blessing Isaac. Okay, no, Jacob. He thought he was blessing Jacob, but he. Yeah, there we go. Okay, got too many patriarchs here. Yeah. But after it was done, and then when Jacob came and said, now, Dad, don't you have a blessing for me because I was tricked out of it? What did Isaac say? He said, he said, and this is how it shall be. It's like he was conceding the point when you read the text there. In other words, he admits, all along I was fighting against what God really wanted, but finally at the very end, God finally has broken me, and I'm doing what God had planned. And I can't help but believe that when you look at a few of these instances in his life, up until this time he had basically lived, shall we say, by his senses. Because when you read the text, you find out his taste came into play. He loved his son's meat. His touch came into place, his hearing and his smell. Everything was coming into place there, and that's why he ended up blessing as he did, because his senses were telling him it's okay. And I'm wondering if all throughout his life he basically, again, lived by his senses. Should we say this world's way of looking at things and thinking about things. And God had to finally break him. No, you trust the promises of God, because your senses will deceive you at times. Your senses are not going to be accurate. And therefore, as I said at the start, I wonder if this is simply a reminder to us again of here is a man, these ups and downs of faith, but finally in the end, when he did acknowledge that God really was blessing Jacob over Esau, that this really was a big act of faith on his part. And that's why the writer of Hebrews would say it was a big act of faith, because it really was for a guy who had really been struggling so much during all of his life. And so I put a couple of quotes on your sheet there, and it's evident even by the quotes that other writers aren't exactly sure how to, shall we say, bring this all together and say, oh yeah, it's very clear, this is the way it is. But I think maybe as you think of this and struggle with this, you begin to realize that, yes, he did struggle throughout life a good bit with trusting God. Even though he knew certain things, it was like, but I'm not willing to submit to it until at the very end he was broken, if you will, and he submitted to it. Well, we're gonna have to stop with that one, and we have about 2 minutes for our church history heroes of the day, and that's too bad because these are, again, some really great heroes. But if you look at page 2 of your sheet, the 2 heroes that we want to mention are John Wycliffe and William Tyndale, and you can see their years there on your sheet. These were both Bible translators, and they were heroes because both of them were willing to pay a tremendous price to get the Bible translated into English. And of course, for us today, I mean, you can just go home and look at how many English translations you have on your shelf and act like, well, that's the way it's always been. No, it hasn't been. People have literally died to give their life so that we today could have a Bible in the English language. So Wycliffe was a genuine scholar of his day, taught at Oxford. He was also a priest at Lutterworth. Remember, at this time, the Bible was in Latin, and the Bible was only confined to a church. So you didn't go home, and even if you would have had a Latin copy, you wouldn't have been able to read it, basically. And so you had to simply trust whatever the priest said was true. Okay? So Wycliffe simply realized, wait a minute, there are so many problems in the Roman Catholic Church, and the more that he studied the Bible, the more these problems became evident to him, like transubstantiation, indulgences, the confessional. He realized you're saved only by grace through faith, Christ alone. There's no other way to be saved. Well, you can imagine the Roman Catholic Church didn't want to hear any of that. And he wrote a lot of tracts, a lot of literature combating the Roman Catholic Church. And so his whole point was, I need to get the Bible to people in the English language so the common person can read the Bible. Latin was basically a common language. I mean, especially the Roman Catholic Church was doing it. I mean, if you were in Germany, you would have been speaking German, or in France, early days of French and various things. But when it came to the Bible, they didn't have a Bible in English. And so his desire was, okay, we need to get the Bible to people in their own language. Well, if you want to say fortunately or unfortunately, he died before it was finished, okay? Although then there were people who finished it, and so there is a Wycliffe Bible today that had been finished by others. The interesting thing is, the Council of Constance, about 31 years after he died and was buried, his teachings were being spread so much that they said, we cannot allow this, so they condemned his teaching. They said, we need to find everything he ever wrote and burn it, and we need to exhume his body. Whatever remains, we need to burn it, and then we're going to throw it in the river and scatter it so nobody can say this is where Wycliffe lives, or where Wycliffe was buried. And that's what they did. Can you believe that? A little over 40 years after he died, they hated him so much they exhumed his body, they burned the remains, and then they scattered it. Wow. But that's part of the heritage. Tyndale, very quickly, when he was born, as you see, his dates are a little bit later. He's in England, and there are a lot of restrictions. You cannot translate the Bible. You cannot read, be trying to teach the Bible in English, etc., or it's under pain of death. So all he wanted to do, told the king, all I want to do is I want to translate the Bible from the original Greek and Hebrew, because remember, Wycliffe did from the Latin, but now there had been a real renaissance of learning, and they found all these Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, and people started studying the language. He said, I just want to translate a Bible into the English from the original Hebrew and Greek. King said, no way. And so he realized he was going to need to flee to the continent if he was going to do that, and so literally he fled all over Europe. And was translating the Bible while the king, if you will, had his henchmen out trying to trace him, until the day came when actually somebody turned him in. And so he had translated the New Testament, hadn't completed completely the Old Testament yet, and as he had done them, he'd actually sent copies back into England in English. So you can imagine how upset the king was that here we're trying to find him, and here somehow this Tyndale Bible is getting back onto British soil in English. But it did. But when he was turned in, when they caught him, of course he was considered guilty, and so they ended up strangling him and then executing him. I think they burned him as well, and it was all because he believed the Bible needed to be in the language of the people. And the quote I put on your sheet there is, of course, a famous quote in church history, where he simply said he wants the day to come when the plowboy, the person who's behind the plow, will know more of the Scripture than the Roman Catholic priesthood. Boy, you talk about a slam on the priest when he told a priest that. I want the average British subject to be able to read the Bible and know more than you do as the so-called expert in religion. And by the grace of God, his prayer was answered after his death. Okay, we need to conclude with that. So Lord willing, bring your sheet back with you next week, and we will pick up and we'll conclude with Jacob and Joseph.